Thanks, Steve. That was excellent precursor to what I need to visit with you all about. My name is Brian Lipscomb. I'm the CEO for Energy Keepers, which is the tribe's company that we set up to operate and manage the Salish Kasanka Kalispell hydroelectric facility, just up the river from us here, about 70 miles, 4.5 miles downstream from the lake. It manages the top 10 feet of the lake, 1.2 million acre feet of storage there. A little bit about my background. I've been born and raised on the reservation, St. Ignatius. I still remember coming to football games in Plains when the old trestle bridge was out here and the bus whacked mirrors with the semi. I went off and got my degree in civil engineering while working for the Forest Service, actually, on the Lolo National Forest, and with a little bit of a stint here in Plains. About 3 years, Kurt and I were reminiscing. We were there at the same time. I was the zone engineer, he was in charge of maintenance, so I'd build them and he'd fix them. I was there for a couple of years and then had the opportunity to go home. The tribes brought me back home and put me to work as the Fish and Wildlife Manager and handed me the file for the then Kerr Dam. As I walked through the door and said, okay, this was 1992, we're co-licensees, and we've got all the figured out about buying it out in the future, and I thought that's a long ways away, I won't have to worry about that. And then, but we didn't have fish and wildlife mitigation measures in place yet, so I had to get after that. Did that for about 10 years, implemented some of that for about 3 years. A lot of it was habitat related, habitat acquisition. You'll see in a minute some of the operational constraints that we were able to get mandated on the facility. And then got done with all of that as the director of the Tribal Lands Department. I wanted to get back to hydro. So I took a job in Portland, Oregon as the executive director for what was called the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority at the time. It's a nonprofit. And my job was to facilitate mitigation, fish and wildlife mitigation for the entire federal hydropower system amongst 13 tribes, 4 state agencies, and 2 federal agencies. And of course, the federal system extends from Hungry Horse in Libya at the far upper end of the system all the way to Bonneville Dam down by Portland. So I did that. And then in 2010, the tribes created a Department of Energy. And they needed a director, so they hired me back from Portland, and they handed me the file again. Literally the first day I came back to work was the day after Labor Day weekend, and the Chairman Moran hands me the file and said, Brian, this is your priority again. We're going to buy it, so we need to figure out what we're going to do with it. So we set up the company over the course of a couple of years. Then they appointed me as the CEO and 3 tribal board members, and away we went. And over 36 months, we got everything all staffed up, put our systems in place, and we took over in September of 2015. For us as a tribe, we have many Section 17 corporations, they're called. We're solely owned by the tribe. We can't tax, so as a government, we need a form of income. The Indian Reorganization Act gave us that opportunity. So we're all set up as a family of corporations to bring revenue back to the tribe, to provide services to the tribal members, which obviously benefits the entire community. So Energy Keepers has done well from that perspective. Let's see, November of this year, handed the tribe the dividend check from the previous year, and we exceeded $200 million of cash flow back to the tribe in the first 8.25 years. So we're proud of what we've done with the company. It is positioned to grow into the future, and we intend to grow into the future. When you look at us, the size of other companies like us, independent power producers, we are a couple of magnitudes smaller. So we have a lot of opportunity. So we're going to try to strategically exercise that. So what you'll see today is some of what we're looking at as we look at the energy system in front of us. I'm going to take off right where Steve was chatting, this exact same graph. And we look at it and go, okay, where are we at now? Because what Steve was saying, this is the 2022 graph. It doesn't have 2023 on there. If it did, it would be slightly less than those highest ones. 2023 was very hot, of course, in some areas of the world. Not so hot here, but it is still top 2 or 3. So if you look then, it just continues to build in that real deep red area. And so what we need to do from an energy perspective is understand how is that impacting us? Because as Steve points out, these degrees over here are really not that big when you think about it. 1 degree, 2 degree, what's that? Well, when I'm trying to understand all this and figure out where's the data, where's it coming from, I read a little further and says, to put this into perspective, during the Ice Age, we were 2 degrees below the norm there. So -2, if we could get to a -2, that's where the Ice Age was, when we were Glacier Lake, Missoula. Yeah, right here. So that's kind of a way I think about it. And I also think, like Steve, small changes mean big things. And so for us in the energy world, today, no problem. Yesterday, no problem. That map that Steve showed when it got 108 degrees in Seattle, it was 120 degrees about 200 miles north of there in British Columbia. They have never seen a temperature like that, ever. And on those days, if the wind's not blowing and not much water in the rivers, then the energy available for us here in the Northwest starts to be really tight, almost to the point where you might see rolling brownouts or blackouts. During the summer, that's not so, or during the winter, that's not so bad. I go throw another piece of wood on the fire. I can stay warm in the winter, even when it's below 0. I can't cool off in the summer. And that's part of what we all need to appreciate. The problem with all of this is going to be the summer, not the winters. So the other part that we need to look at then are the cycles. So Steve talked a lot about the ocean temperatures. And for us, again in the energy world, what's driving the extremes are the El Nino and La Nina cycles, which are driven by the ocean temperatures at the equator. So this year, for example, I'll show you a picture in a moment. The forecast is for strong El Nino signal. That's related to how warm the ocean temperatures are off the coast of Chile. Thus the Spanish names for these phenomena. So we're looking at what do these cycles look like? How are they cycling, and what are the extreme ends of those cycles? And so that the El Nino and the La Nina forecast become very important for us as we drill in. And of course, true to form, this forecast, which this is a map from last August. So we're looking at last August, and for us, as you can see, below normal moisture, above normal temperatures. And you might say, well, we certainly weren't above normal 2 weeks ago or a month ago. 23 below. Although, a couple things I would point out, Steve, when we're looking at the extremes, when we look at, especially it's interesting, the El Nino cycle tends to produce some of the coldest winter temperatures. You wrap your head around that for a second. Well, wait a second, it's supposed to be warmer. Well, overall, it is warmer. If you look at the snowpack, which I'll show you in a moment, it's not because we're receiving a lot less moisture, it's because that moisture is coming in the form of rain, way up the mountains. So, by and large, we're warmer, but the difficulty is, or the confusing part, that exacerbates this in the energy world and drives us to 23 below in western Montana, 56 below in eastern Montana, is also caused by the warming atmosphere. You put a warm layer of air over top of the Arctic, and what happens is it creates this polar vortex plunge. So it heats up the North Pole, and it drives that cold air down the globe, someplace. Sometimes it's the United States, east, west, sometimes it's in Europe, but it happens. So March of 2016, coldest temperature ever recorded in the Mission Valley. 28 below, I think we were in Charlotte. This year, 4 or 5 days, we were 23 below twice, 2 mornings in a row at our house in Polson. So cold. And that's driven by that splitting. It's called the splitting of the polar vortex. Drives that cold air down. Why is that important to us? Because it changes the demand for electricity, which I'll talk about here more in a minute. So, back to the climatological aspects first and water supply. So this is our snowpack. As Steve alluded to, we are in bad shape. So that black line is this year. Last year, believe it or not, we ended about right there. Oops. Back up here. Right there where that arrow was. Almost normal. 85, 86%. This year, I'm not guessing we're going to end close to normal. So we might see a new black line up there at the bottom. I don't know. We'll see where we end up in the next couple months. But the forecast, the extended range forecast that we're looking at right now, and we're modeling for energy demand across the Northwest that we do on a daily basis, it's not showing tremendous increase in moisture. It's showing a trend towards warmer, drier for the rest of the winter. And then when we look at the El Nino, La Nina forecast, it's not looking like it's going to wane off until about June-ish, July-ish. The forecast says we'll come out of El Nino, and then what happens from there is we'll head for likely a La Nina. More than half of the first years after an El Nino, you go back into a La Nina cycle. So we're kind of preparing ourselves for that. The last time it was this bad was in 2016. So 2016, this time of year, we were going through a very similar cycle. Low snowpack. We came out of that, went through the summer. Summer wasn't too bad. We came into fall and we switched to a La Nina cycle. And in that switch to a La Nina cycle, the October of 2016, if you go back and look at the moisture coming into the Flathead Basin for the month of October was 300% of normal. It rained every day in October. And the lake filled 3 feet by itself. So the message in all of that is the extremes. Again, what we're seeing since we've taken over the facility is this seemingly, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but it's what we're seeing, an oscillation from El Nino to La Nina, and you're just going back and forth. And it also feels like they're more extreme. So the El Ninos are hotter and more extreme, and the La Ninas are wetter. And what we saw then, as we came out of the last La Nina cycle, is, I'll contrast the two, 2022, we came out of La Nina and went right into El Nino. That was the end of a 3-year cycle La Nina. I'm almost 60, scary enough. Somebody accused me of being a junior elder. Wow, okay. So in my lifetime, when I look back at the record, we've only had a 3-year La Nina in my lifetime. That's only the third one that I've experienced. The first two I wasn't paying attention, didn't see them. So it's really unusual for us to get one in the last 3 years. But we came into 2022, and that's the information in the upper left there. Get my arrow going. There's a lot on this graph, so I'm going to run through it real quick. The orange line there, that's the outflow at our facility. Okay, just downstream, that's a gauge just downstream from the Sariskasonka-Kalispell Dam. The blue line is the inflow, so that's water supply coming in. So that's the Flathead, the Swan River, the Stillwater, and the Whitefish Rivers, generally. There's a few more tributaries, but that makes up the lion's share of it. So that's the inflow and outflow. The dotted line that's kind of wavy there, this one right here, that's lake level. Okay? So the flows are on the left in cubic feet per second. The elevation is on the right. So that's feet of elevation. And then you got the timer across the bottom. A couple other things that are on this graph. This dotted line right there, that's the maximum authorization we have for storing the 1.2 million acre feet of storage that we're authorized to store from the license. The bottom straight line is the bottom elevation. So the license authorizes us to manage the lake between 2883 and 2893 and store 1.2 million acre feet of water for our use. And then it has some limitations on it. And I'll pause there for a second. Before the dam was built, the average high elevation for summer was what the lake's at today, 2888, 5 feet from full pool. That was the average high elevation. There were times, now this is pre-Hungry Horse, pre-Kerr, we saw flows in the lower river here that were 80,000 cubic feet per second before they joined with the Clark's Fork. And we saw Flathead Lake go probably 5 to 6 feet above 2893. So 2899. Yeah. Yeah. And those are that's a natural phenomenon because there's a shelf right at Poulsen, right at the bridge. In Kootenai it's called Quatucknook, where the water goes over. That's what the translation is for Quatucknook. It's where the water goes over that shelf. That rock shelf then, if you imagine at minimum pool, this is the best way to illustrate it. At minimum pool, 2883, we could pass about 3,200 cubic feet per second. At maximum, 2893, we can pass 50,000 cubic feet per second. So that's what can go over that rock shelf. The dam itself, we can move about 80,000 cubic feet per second. So the dam is never the choking point for filling the lake. It's always the rock shelf. So for that year, as we're operating, we're on what's called channel restriction. We're pulling more water at the facility than what can come over that rock shelf. And what happens is you get the forebay starts to draft. So we have to balance all of that, so that we're pulling the maximum amount, but we can't pull too much because you pull down the forebay, which matters then for operations. So we did all of that in 2022, and the lake overfilled by 7 inches. The last time that happened was 1964 flood. I didn't get to see that. So most of us, that has never happened in our lifetime. I can tell you for most of the people in the Flathead Basin, they had never seen that. It didn't cause a lot of damage. It got some docks wet. I've got some cool pictures in where the Swan River comes in at Marina Cay. That river was running over top of those docks at the Marina Cay. And people were fired up. They called me up and said, we're going to come down there. We had 2 gates out of commission. They weren't bothering us at all. It was all planned with the FERC. We're going to take over that facility and open those gates for you if you don't open them. Just threatened the facility that's federally licensed. I got to call the FBI. So yeah. Bottom line, that was 2022 on the back end of a La Nina cycle. Now let's go to 2023, right down here. I tried to forget a little bit about 2023, so I put it on the lower right, but you can't see it. I'm just kidding. So the other dotted line that you see right here, those are the minimum in-stream flows for the lower Flathead River, okay? So that's a constraint within the license. We can fill the facility, exercise our authorization to store 1.2 million acre feet of storage, but we have to provide a minimum in-stream flow while we're doing it. That minimum in-stream flow, when you match it up to the graphs prior to the dam being built, we never saw 12,500 cubic feet per second in the middle of June, ever. Several of them were much higher than that, more like 20,000. So minimum is really minimum. And then as it wanes off in the summertime, the important part is right here. When it comes to filling the lake, and I'll jump to this graph now. Can you guys all see that very good? Or do I need to duck down? How about here? I'm worried about you guys. Can you see it? Okay. So when we're managing to the minimum in-stream flow, a couple of highlights. If we don't balance how far we draft the lake this time of year, on a dry year, you can't bring the lake all the way back up because there's not enough water. So last year, we managed with the Army Corps of Engineers authorizations and didn't draft the lake all the way. And we actually started holding water a full 6 weeks ahead of time. So the other limitation we have for the 2883 and the 2893 is an agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers for some maximum elevations that we can't exceed. The first one's 2883. We try to hit that in the middle of April. So it creates a hole for spring runoff. And we prevent or can minimize localized flooding. Then the other elevations are as you're refilling by the end of May, 3 feet from full pool. And then we can go to full pool June 15th. So if we don't manage those refill targets with the Army Corps of Engineers on a pretty frequent basis in the spring, you can miss refill. I'm glad to say that even last year, and people kind of missed it, we got 2892.8. So that close to full pool. So we achieved our goals. So the interesting part about all this, though, is when you look at then the blue line there compared to the one in the upper left, you can see the decrease in so the area underneath the graph is the volume of water. So the volume of water under the blue line in the upper left hand compared to the volume of water in the lower right one. And you start to get an idea of just in 2 years, the extremities of what Steve was referencing, and I showed you in those graphs where things move like that. And my sense of it, as we're heading up that curve and going for those upper temperatures, it's not going to be this nice smooth line. What we're going to get are these crazy up and downs, and we're going to experience stuff like we have never experienced. And that's what we need to design the energy system for and be prepared to participate in as things go forward. So I'm going to switch now. I'm going to go back and talk again about these extremes and these little changes in the context of energy demand. This is a graph for the United States, and what you see happening then is generally a decreasing of heating degree days are blue. So that means it's getting easier to keep people warm in the winter. And you see an increase of cooling degree days in the red. So what that's doing is it's shifting our demand for electricity, which is a primary driver for heating, from the winter to the summer. And we're seeing now on that day we went to 120 degrees in British Columbia, energy prices in the wholesale market, which is where we participate, hit the price cap set by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, $1,000 per megawatt hour. To give you a sense of what that means today, for example, the market's not open. We traded for today last week. I think we were trading $40, $50 per megawatt hour. In 2016, when we took over the facility, we were sub $20 per megawatt hour. So going to the price cap is a phenomenal thing, and we end up going there because of shortage. There's not enough supply to meet the demand. And so that right there then puts pressure on us as well to say, okay, in those extreme hot times, we're obligated to try to help the rest of the world meet their energy needs. And we have the water to do it. So, as Steve said, carbon production. So what's the world doing about this? What's the United States doing about this? This is a great graphic where it comes from. Transportation, here's what I tell people, 3 things. Home and industrial, heating primarily, 30%, transportation, 30%, and electricity generation, 30%. About. So just remember all these numbers I'm about to show you. Remember those 3 things. So the strategy is electrify transportation, electrify home and industrial, heating and processes, and move the generation of electricity to something that's not carbon producing. Okay, so that's the strategy. This is another pie graph that kind of illustrates that. A couple of more details. Here's us in the Pacific Northwest. This is our electricity supply. So we're actually not that bad. In fact, Montana, where do we rank? Do you all know where do we rank in terms of renewable energy production? Where would you guess?
Top 5%.
Pretty good. 8. We're number 8. Yeah, because if you look, we have a couple of small gas plants around Butte. One of them peaker, so it doesn't run all the time. And Colstrip. That other coal plant there by Hardin is shut down already. So the only production of electricity we have is Colstrip. The one up at Sydney, that's shut down the last couple of years as well. And Colstrip's only 2 of the 4 units, of course, are left. So we're not that bad off. I think, am I wrong, is Paradise Northwestern Energy? Is that correct? So even Northwestern is 60-some% renewable. So pretty good when you look at the rest of the country. For us that aren't customers of Northwestern, I'm a customer of Mission Valley Power. We're 99.9% renewable. Our electricity comes from Bonneville Power Administration, as does Flathead Electric Co-op, Missoula Electric Co-op. The co-ops in western Montana are preference customers of BPA. So see all those giant hydro circles? That's where our electricity comes from primarily. Combined with, there's a little purple one right in the middle. That's a nuke plant. Only nuke plant in the Northwest. Columbia River Generating Station. So by and large, when you look across the Northwest, we're not that bad off. We do have some ways to go though. So the coal plants in Wyoming and Montana, northern Nevada, the one over in Centralia, Washington, they all have a calendar. One of them's because of carbon, but the other is they're at the end of life. You know, to Colstrip, we were building the roads for the towers to build the power line to Colstrip when I started working for the Forest Service in 1983. So that facility is old, end of life. So it's time. As with most of the others, they're not prematurely closing, but it's also a push towards move us to something different. You'll see quite a bit of gas mixed in there yet, and there'll still be gas in our future because you need to meet the peaks. If you look broader across the West, you get to see a different picture. And if I had more of these that went all the way across the country, you'd see a really different picture. We are tremendously blessed here in the Northwest because of our hydro assets. It drives over between 70 to 80% of the electricity generation in the West is hydro. So we have a lot less farther to go than the rest of the country. Now there's some issues with hydro. Anybody ask me, and I'd always say, not all hydro is created equal. We could have a whole nother talk about that, but we won't today. But I show this to say that not all the world is us. California, you can see they primarily rely on solar and nuclear. A little bit of hydro, but mostly other assets. And they're building out renewable like crazy across California and the Southwest, so you're starting to see a lot of solar going in. If you had a bigger picture, especially you get over into the east and the southeast, and it is primarily coal. So that's where the graph that Steve had that showed coal burning so much, it's mostly in that part of the country. But for us, it's a smaller issue. But those small issues make for big problems if you don't have the supply you need when it's 23 below. Okay, so when you think about what needs to be replaced, then you got to look at what are the assets primarily at this point in time. Now, there's a lot of cutting edge stuff. We like to talk about hydrogen. We like to talk about fusion. We like to talk about small nuclear reactors. None of those work yet. They're close, but none of them are working yet. So what's working right now that you could build and take to the market and have it be economically enough to compete today are primarily two plus one. Solar and wind plus a battery in both cases. So those are the options that we have to replace as we pull electricity out. And I'll show you the magnitude of that in a minute. So for us here in Montana, this is a wind map for the United States at 100 meters. So you look at those giant wind turbines in the Columbia Basin as you drive to Portland. Those are about 100 meters high. And so you look at this map and say, okay, where's the best wind resources in the United States at that 100 meters above the ground surface level? And you can see northeast Montana is really prime. So, but there's a problem. There's no transmission. So we don't have transmission to get it out of there at this point. About as much wind as we can get built in northern Montana, northeast Montana, is built. As Colstrip goes away, you can push more wind out through that terminal, but it's not, I mean, that's a transition, and it's a long ways when you look at the crow flies from southeast Montana to north central Montana. That's a few hundred miles. So we got to get transmission. Solar is the other great resource. Problem with solar is we're a little ways north. So in January, our solar map looks like the one on the left. In June, it looks like the one on the right. We're golden. We can survive June with a solar panel. You can't survive December 21st with a solar panel. Solar in Montana on December 21st, the shortest day of the year, is good for 4 hours. Doesn't produce any electricity after that. On a sunny December 21st. So for us, solar, not likely the answer. Wind, probably, combined with our hydro. Where is this all headed for the country? When you put all these numbers together and you think about electrifying transmission, that's an increase in demand. Electrifying home heating and industrial processes, increase in demand. You have increased use because of population growth, all increasing demand. And then retirement of fossil fuels. The deficit for replacement gets tremendous. So if you looked at just new clean energy in the middle by 2035, 6.6 thousand terawatt hours. I know, terawatts, that's not one I had memorized from engineering class, by the way. That's a bunch, okay? By 2050, 10,900 terawatt hours of capacity build out. And so if you said, and I stole these from Mother Jones because I looked at all the data, Energy Information Association, I look at those reports annually, I look at the reports from the Northwest annually, and this data comes right from the Energy Information Association, but it's a lot nicer graphic. They're a lot more creative at Mother Jones than they are at the EIA, so I grabbed them and looked at them and said, this is a great illustration of where we're headed. So if you think about wind, solar, batteries, and transmission, because we got to move it, this is what it's going to take by 2050 to make that happen. 75,000 miles of new high voltage transmission. That'll wrap the globe 3 times, sorry. Enough wind farms to cover the area equal to Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee combined. Okay? Solar panels, enough to cover Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. I looked that up and did the acres. That's about 10 of our reservations. So it's about 12 million acres. So our reservation touched 10. So obviously going to be some advancement over time. I'm hoping that some of these other resources come to bear. I think if you were to ask me today, I don't think we succeed in electrifying transportation with the battery. I think we succeed with electrifying transportation with a fuel cell. But in order to get to a fuel cell, we need hydrogen. We have no infrastructure for hydrogen. We're getting there, but we're a ways from there. So if that happens, this will come down. The demand will come down, so these graphs won't be, maybe we end up with 4,000 terawatt need instead of 6,000 terawatt need, for example, by 2030, if we get converted from batteries to fuel cells. You still have to produce the hydrogen, though, which is an electrolysis process. When you think about it, it makes a little bit of sense because, as Steve said, we're not seeing less water. In fact, we might see more water when we don't need it. 2022, we didn't need more water in the spring. So that would tell you, well, use the water, turn it into hydrogen, store the hydrogen. So those are some ways to think about this as we go forward. So I'll stop there. Lots to cover. You can drill in. I can talk for 3 minutes or 3 hours about all this stuff, and I want to leave Monica a minute. So.
No, 1 minute.